Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second session of the Interdisciplinary Global Educators Working Group. Yesterday, I sent out an email to all of you listing the schedule for today. Nothing really changed from the original schedule. And then there was a link to the document that we talked about during Monday workshop. So we talked about creating this document so that you guys can use to ask questions or to put your own suggestions to other colleagues who are working on projects that you might be familiar with and that they are not. So it's a way to share the resources among ourselves. And again, I'll be monitoring this for questions that come up, and we'll reach out to our colleagues at Pitt and other places that might be able to help us with necessary resources that you want to use in your classrooms. Does anyone have any questions about any of it? Any of the email messages that I shared, the schedule, anything else? All right, then we will begin with introducing our speaker for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Cindy Mcnulty. Cindy Mcnulty recently retired after 44 years of teaching English and social studies, most recently AP Human Geography and Intro to Global Studies. She has worked with several centers within UCIS, but most closely with the Global Studies Center and the National Consortium for Teaching Asia. Her association with the Global Studies Center is extensive, having attended book groups, mini courses, and a Fulbright case study tour to Egypt, which resulted in a curriculum unit examining the range of possibilities for Egypt after the Arab Spring. Cindy has also made curriculum implementation presentations for several Global Studies Center and the National Consortium for Teaching of Asia mini courses, most recently on the topic of the global water crisis. For 3 summers, Cindy served as one of the core instructors for the Governor's School for Global and International Studies at Pitt, at the University of Pittsburgh. And in the 2018-19 school year, she piloted the college in the high school course, Intro to Global Studies. She also created and directed a Global Competence Certificate program, the Global Competence Initiative at Oakland Catholic High School. Cindy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And let me share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, let me go back here a minute. First, let me say that I think that some of what I have to say today may be preaching to the choir, in the sense that certainly I know that some of you, Tracy and Michael Ann, perhaps the best examples here, have been doing this kind of work for quite a while. And also in terms of talking about how important all of this is, you're all here, including those of you making a real sacrifice to get up early in the morning from the West Coast to be here. So to some extent, I think I'm preaching to the choir, but what I have found over years is that when I have to convince other people, other teachers, administrators, parents, when I've got to convince them why all of this is important, my ongoing conversations with others about this have helped me to continue to refine my own explanations of why all of this is important. And so I would say in most ways, that's my objective today, is to give you some more ideas about how all of us collectively as educators talk about this, and to give you a lot of resources that you can use when you are talking to others. And again, you are from very, very different schools, and some of you are well along the way of this, this project to globalize curriculum and do interdisciplinary work. But others of you may not be. You may be the only people in your building doing this kind of work. So, I start with this quote because I do think that, you know, I am now no longer in the classroom, but for those of you who are, we're preparing individuals who are going to live in a global world much, much different than the students from when I started to teach in the 1970s. Okay, so what I'm going to do here today is talk about how we can make a case for both global studies and interdisciplinary curriculum, and why I think this is a unique moment to be doing that. I'm going to talk about building a critical mass of teachers and a receptive school environment, again, knowing that you are on very different places in the continuum of doing that. I'm going to talk a little bit about thinking outside the box, because I think enhancing the single discipline course is another wedge to enable us to, you know, force especially schools that are a little reluctant to start seeing how interdisciplinary work can you know, enhance the school. I'm going to give you quite a few resources, and any of you who have the link to the Google Doc up, I'm going to be referencing 3 of the key links, at least 3 that I put in there recently. And then I would like to hear a little bit about obstacles that may be particular to your schools or not. So to begin with, I do think we are in a very, very unique moment, and particularly when we're talking about global competence, and of course it's the pandemic. And when Michael was talking about these elements within global studies, connections, divisions, disruptions, inequalities, and productive possibilities, all of it obviously applies to the pandemic. So even if what you're starting with is conversations that are taking place with your colleagues, you know, in the faculty room, across the water fountain or the coffee machine, or with students, to use the pandemic as a jumping off point to make them begin to think about why these global connections are so important and the ways in which they are affecting all of us. The second one is the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And again, it's a moment that I think offers us a great opportunity to talk about how interconnected and interdependent we are. One of the estimates that I read was $9 billion worth of trade a day was tied up in that. And this is also a place where all kinds of disciplines could address this. Certainly, you know, in an economics class, in a science class, talking about the engineering, in a politics class or a history class, the history of the canal itself. So I think that also offers us a really unique moment to get people thinking about all of this, that 2 years ago we didn't have. And even when I think about how early could we start with this kind of education, I think we could start really early. And this is a graphic that I've used even with older students, but you can make even elementary school students understand how connected we are through the lens of their Legos. So when we're talking about how important all of this is, I think there are a couple of folks here that I always reference. One is James Becker, when he wrote the book, Needed a Global Context, the Study of Nations and People. And he defines global education as an effort to help individuals to see the world as a single and global system and to see themselves as participants of that. And I think this echoes what Michael was saying about not only these connections, divisions, et cetera, but the productive possibilities that we are participants in this system. It's not just something that's happening out there. Another person who I like to reference talks about, when schools are resisting this idea, our students becoming more global competent, we don't have the room in our schedules. We don't have the room in our curriculum to add all of these global things. And the point that she's making is we don't need new subjects. We need new ways of thinking about these subjects. And the part of the quote that I highlighted at risk of reading to you is, it's a matter of teaching students to ask about whatever they're learning, why does this matter to me, to my people and place, and to the world? So it's that habitual orientation of connecting the local to the global. And again, I think that's where things like the current pandemic and the Suez situation offer us two very, very vivid examples. Now, this is a document that I put into the Google Doc for you. And this is how I'm going to go about talking about the rest of this. And that is Primary Source created a document that looks at, what do we need for schools to begin to think more globally? And they came up with these 4 action items, they call them: curriculum, institutional practices, professional development, and school culture. And because you're all here working on curriculum, I'm going to kind of start it at the other end. And I want to talk first about school culture and cultivating. And again, you're all obviously leaders in this because you're here. How do schools begin to really, as institutions, address these kinds of issues and expand curriculum? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a combination of institutional practices, especially partnerships, and professional development. So to begin, school cultures and institutional practices. I think one of the things that I think is really important is that schools articulate their culture and institutional practices, that it's not just something that a couple of teachers are doing and maybe it'll show up in a newsletter, but that schools actually articulate this so that even the students could say, as I think I'm illustrating from a Korean school that I visited, that the objective of the institution was balanced education of knowledge and virtues. And one of the institutional practices that promoted all of that was the study of foreign languages. And so on the top floor, you see the sign, no Korean, only foreign languages here. And so the institutional practice was on that floor, and who knows how much you're all teachers, how much it was actually practiced, but the students knew that that was the expectation. So that's an example of how a school articulated what they think is important. Faculty buy-in and building a critical mass. And this is where we're going to have a little bit of audience participation here. I've requested Tracy and Michael Ann to say something. When you get, every faculty has skeptics. And so I could just imagine some folks, good teachers, but who I've known who have worked for a long time and who would say something like, oh, this is just another one of those faddish educational movements. Now we're going to be global. Now we're going to be interdisciplinary. And that's the attitude that I think needs to be addressed. And I think one of the ways you do that is to build on what exists and seize every opportunity to partner and collaborate until what you've established is really a critical mass within your school. And so because I know them well and they have done this, I've asked if Michael Ann and Tracy would say a word about how did you come to start to pair science with social studies. So take it away, Michael Ann and Tracy.
Sorry, we're having technical difficulties. We just showed up upside down. Sorry. Okay, I think
that's all right.
All right. You want to go first? No.
I see you right side up.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So at Swickley Academy, this was probably about 10 years ago, we started a global studies program, and we had we started with a course that was interdisciplinary between English, history, and science. And it was a required course. So we approached it as global studies was the subject. But we were looking at our objectives and trying to, within each discipline, and trying to merge them and not looking at it as silos. From there, we started looking in sort of across faculty at different course options. So after that course was a go and had been running for a year or two, I think, I partnered with a math teacher. I'm a chemistry teacher. I partnered with a math teacher, and we taught a course called World of Data. That was a global issues, data, statistics, data analysis, big data course. And then Michael Ann, Cindy, and I worked together at Governor's School. The three of us built, a totally unsiloed curriculum together. And then Michael Ann and I used that experience, and we built a 1-trimester, completely gamified course for Swickley Academy called Global Game. And so when we approached that, the course was running in the 3rd trimester, and what we decided was we wanted to come up with the strands that were global. So we wanted students to leave the course having a good understanding, basic understanding of, now help me here, migration, consumerism, sustainability, global health, and there's another one if we think of it. So the 5 that were the most important. And then students, sort of as they went, there was like an online game board that we used that was a Prezi, and we can share that. And students could do a little bit of everything, but then as they went along through the course, they could sort of major in one of those threads, and really by the end of it, do their final project on one of them and become like an expert in global health or urbanization. An expert in urbanization. So they were able to really dig into it. So in those threads, we worked together on the activities that incorporated both geography, history, social studies, as well as science concepts. And so students weren't necessarily doing one or the other, they were doing both. They were looking at global studies. So it was very successful and the kids really, really liked it. So I'm actually applying that now to world history, and we're looking at combining some of the 10th grade world history curriculum with science.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I know Raylene and Jackie, who during the Q&A can maybe say something about what they're doing too, because I can certainly, I think independent schools have an opportunity or a receptiveness to this kind of thing that other schools don't necessarily. And so when I said that partner with what already exists, I'll give you an example of a school, my own school. We do not have any interdisciplinary courses at all. And yet what we tried to do was work with what existed and start to create interdisciplinary activities that, again, hopefully would spark an interest and an ability to do a little bit more of this when it was successful. And I know Mara Doyle presented to you the other day, and she and Heidi worked across social studies and English. But one example from what had already existed was a few years ago when we used social studies was studying World War I, world literature read All Quiet on the Western Front, and we showed the film Joyeux Noël, and the French department got involved as well. And so kind of simple, working with what was already there, and the package of it was interdisciplinary, even though none of the courses were particularly interdisciplinary. So, you know, another way I think you can do this, and I'm talking a little bit across the board. Some of you, again, have very receptive schools and some of you don't. But I think research projects can also take the single discipline, and I put that in quotation marks because increasingly, I think, you know, a lot of teachers are bringing multiple lenses into their work. But, you know, I think research projects extend course content, build on students' particular interests, and create something interdisciplinary. In this case, it was a research project that the student was very interested in art, and obviously, you know, created something about Van Gogh and Japanese art. Working again with, for instance, science teachers. I know nothing about CO2 capture. So I simply walked downstairs, talked to the science teacher, asked if they would be willing to check the science on this project. And when he said he would, then it opened an opportunity for me to say to a student, yes, in this social studies class, you may do this research project because the science teacher and I are going to work on evaluating it. The other one that you see there is was working with the AP Italian teacher on World War II American soldiers buried in Italy. Who knew? I certainly didn't. Another thing about creating a globally minded school culture and is really starting conversations with other teachers about, you know, how they might be contributors that we aren't aware of at all. And so My students were blown away when they found out that one of their math teachers speaks fluent French because she served in Benin in the Peace Corps. And again, in a small way, it keeps extending the school culture. Students start to ask questions and take for granted, oh, there are these elements within the school that I can plug into. I don't think the Ellis folks are here this morning, but I was going to ask them to chime in. I think making attending professional development events fun is another way to just get more faculty buy-in and build that critical mass that I'm talking about. And Ellis, who you will hear from after me, the team of Hala, Jessica, and Jennifer, they were part of this program last year. And the Ellis folks often show up in groups at these professional development activities. And I think it's a great way to build collegiality, but also that critical mass. And the example that I have here is also a collaboration between the Global Studies Center and the National Consortium of Teaching of Asia. And they do these mini courses. Michael Land spoke at one that I'm going to mention last year. Here's one other thought about expanding a critical mass and really impacting your school to begin to think globally. You've heard the old adage that if somebody came back from the 19th century, they would not recognize a hospital, they would not recognize a factory, but they would recognize a schoolroom because it looks the same. Well, I have been thinking a lot about drawing in graduates, drawing in alums, because I think what I found is, a lot of my students, my former students, moved out into disciplines and jobs that really are starting to be much more interdisciplinary. And so do you have any opportunities to contact and perhaps, invite your graduates to address students in individual classes, address them on a career day, have them come to your guidance center? Do you have any special programming? And again, I know some schools do that. You can have graduates come in and talk about the really different things that they're doing. The example that I have here is from one of our students who got a master's degree in environmental science from Penn, but she's also a dancer and an artist. And the work that she's been doing in several of these environmental centers is interdisciplinary. And she explains it in ways that even I could not imagine. And when she says, she uses dance, environmental science, art, and so forth to inspire curiosity, empathy, and connection through creative environment and encounters with nature. And so she has art exhibits and projects that are, I'm going to quote her, more intuitive, emotional, empathic, creative, and accessible than traditional presentations of science. And I think that if you can find these folks within your school community and access them and bring them in, maybe even just to talk to faculty, it's a way they have a credibility. She has a credibility that I don't in terms of how these kinds of fields are interdisciplinary. One of the documents that I provided for you, and again, I'm moving now a little bit into some of the resources that are out there to get some help with this. It's called the Global Education Checklist, and you'll see it's in the Google Doc for you. I'm pulling that just so I also have it in front of me. It's for teachers, school systems, state education agencies. And what it does is goes through all the kinds of questions schools and administrators and teachers and so forth need to be asking each other, need to be asking themselves about how they're approaching this and how how far along are their projects and what do they need to consider. And what I like about this particularly, I just grabbed one screenshot for you. For the global issues, for instance, it asks for each of these divisions for students, knowledge, skills, and participation. And so we're back to, Michael's idea of the productive possibilities. And this document, which is quite extensive, gives you a set of questions so that you have something really sort of tangible that you and your department, your school, your administration, or whatever can work through. And I think the fact that it comes from the American Forum on Global Education, gives it some credibility too. And one of the things that I always say about the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia is that, and now I'm talking almost 20 years ago, participating in that gave me a credibility when I went to my administration and said, we need Asia in the curriculum. And I think, having credibility from these sources, whether it's through we've done some professional development with them, or we've just done extensive reading about what they've researched, I think is important. So professional development and some resources for you. One of, I think, the most important leaders in professional development and one of the really tremendous sources for global education is the Asia Society. And they were the leaders. They were out front years before others were talking about the need. So they were reaching beyond Asia. That wasn't enough. And they established the Center for Global Education. And I put this in the Google Doc. And if you start clicking around, you'll see that they got professional development, educator resources, and this is, I wanted to pull up a couple of the divisions within their ideas section. Global school design. So again, you can't, I have stolen things from all the best. I get on other schools' websites, I look at what kinds of things they're doing, anything from summer reading. Do they have a global program? Do they have student exchanges? And I take ideas from the best. I didn't try to reinvent the wheel. And so they have global school design, assessment shells. I'm going to talk about that in a minute because immediately people are like, well, how do you assess all of this? Just to point out, global competence outcome rubrics. We need to measure it. People like data. Once again, you don't have to invent that. Science and global competency. I know a number of the groups here have scientists as part of their projects. And this is, yes, Tracy, and this is a great resource, a rationale for why and how to make science education global in nature. So again, you don't have to be a voice shouting in the wilderness. There are people out there who also are doing this work. And I thought this performance assessment shell, it's in the Google Doc. It's, again, very extensive. I particularly pulled this up for I won't see in my notes now. Oh, Westridge, because you were talking about using the library to teach research and pairing with the social studies teachers. So you see along the sidebar, there are formative tasks, summative task, and conclusion. And this screenshot just gives you an idea about how detailed this assessment is for doing research projects. You know, what makes a good position paper topic? And so I thought particularly those of you doing that project could use this. I'm watching my time, and so I'm just going to highlight this for you. Once again, these are all materials from the Asia Society, and number one, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but secondly, I think seeing the way they have articulated these things was very, very helpful for me in terms of really refining the way I would explain any of these things. And here again, they have a global competence matrix for science, because a number of you are doing that. And, you know, you can look at these yourself. The PowerPoint will be made available to you. I don't know what any of you are doing July 29th and 30th, but I thought I would bring to your attention that the Asia Society also does a lot of work with virtual classes right now, and this is one that you can sign up for free from their West Coast, you West Coast folks. This is from them. So the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs also has something. Unfortunately, this year it is concurrent with what we're doing right now, but last year I think Veronica, Maya, and I all attended parts of this, the Global Teaching Dialogue, so you can get yourself on a mailing list for that. And the Department of Education also has a rubric, again, to help you think about how to articulate what you're trying to do. Also, I'm going to make a quick pitch for more professional development. The Global Studies Center often works now with the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia, doing mini courses. And they're always interdisciplinary, and there is always a teacher who talks about curriculum implementation. So there's also, you know, a very practical application. Michael Ann was the curriculum consultant on this one that was really terrific last year. And then they did another one about water in the second semester. So just a reminder, there are resources for you. And I added quite a few today. And so I am kind of done. I would like to hear your reactions, but after I say one more thing, and that is, you know, it's a journey. I would say some schools, and I'll only speak for my own, you know, it takes a long time and a long commitment to change curriculum. You know, people often say things about schools like it's like trying to turn an ocean liner, and I think there is a little bit of truth to that. And you know, it's a process, and it requires a lot of patience. But the other thing that I think is really good about professional development is you are working with colleagues who are like-minded. So I know that's throwing a lot at you, especially you West Coast people who are, you know, it's still very early in the morning for you, but I hope that's useful. I hope the materials in the Google Doc are going to be useful for you. And if you, I think I ran just about to the end of my time, so we may need to keep any questions or whatever until the Q&A after Ellis shows you what they did last year with their project. Would you say that's fair, Maya, that any questions can be held until after they give their presentation?
I would agree so. If anybody has an urge to ask a question right now, we're flexible, so we can do that now, or we can just wait until the Ellis team presents.
I'd say let's wait till Ellis presents. I don't want to cut into any of their time.
All right. Thank you, Cindy. Let me pull up my window here quickly. So at this time, I'd like to introduce the team of speakers: Holly Mon, Jessica Nolan, and Jennifer Lacken. Jessica, Jen, and Holly are lower school teachers at the Ellis School in Pittsburgh. Jessica teaches 4th grade reading, writing, and social studies. Jen teaches 3rd grade math, and Holly teaches 3rd grade reading. And both Jen and Holly teach 3rd grade writing and social studies. The team came together last year to examine the social studies units on immigration that span both grades. And with that, I will turn it over to you guys to present.
Thanks, Maya. I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen. Am I set to do that? Okay, so good morning. I'm Jessica Nolan, and I teach 4th grade at the Ellis School, which is an all-girls school in the Shady Side area of Pittsburgh. We are very fortunate at Ellis to be part of a learning community that is very dedicated to building students' global competency, and really essentially in every area. We as teachers at Ellis hear about it all the time. And it's a real pleasure to be able to be part of such a community. We're also really fortunate to have the ability to make these kinds of changes to our curriculum and have that authorship. So after Holly and Jen and I started discussing what we saw as a connection between 3rd and 4th grade social studies, we started thinking about how to build upon that and enhance that. And so we were inspired to participate in last summer's Interdisciplinary Global Educators Workshop. And I'll just say one of the great gifts of that week was the gift of time. We just are never able to simply have time. We have far too little of it. And so we were given the opportunity to have time to discuss ideas, to explore resources, and just to benefit from the expertise of last year's presenters. And so we came in with a plan that at the end of 3rd grade, Jen and Holly had traditionally introduced 3rd graders to the idea of immigration. And I, as the 4th grade social studies teacher, saw an opportunity to sort of build upon what they had already introduced. And so we started talking about that and saw this as a great way to dive into that a little bit more. And so during one of our breakout sessions last year, Dr. Goodhart popped into our breakout room, and we were sort of wrestling with some ideas related to what we would present to our students or what changes we would make. And so while we don't really have school buy-in as an obstacle, one of the obstacles we were facing was we really wanted our students to see themselves in this immigration unit. And it really wasn't just a unit, it's sort of just a way of teaching throughout the year, though it did pop up with more concentrated focus throughout the year at certain times. And so he kind of challenged us to think about the idea of immigration and maybe remove that I am from immigration. And I should pop ahead here so you can see that. and think about it more in terms of the idea of migration, this much broader idea of movement of people and ideas and culture. And that sort of opened up kind of a whole new world for us. So we're going to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we did in 3rd grade and 4th grade. And I'm going to leave it to Holly now to talk a little bit about some of our DEI work and 3rd grade work. And then I'll tell a little bit more about what we've done in 4th grade since last summer.
Great, thanks, Jess. So hi, I'm Holly. I'm one of the 3rd grade teachers. I teach reading for all of 3rd grade, and then writing and social studies as well. And one of the things, as Jess mentioned, we feel very fortunate at Ellis to have a lot of buy-in, both from our administrators and our fellow teachers, into doing this work and shifting our curriculum and constantly finding ways to make our curriculum more inclusive, more global, to make sure that our students are going out to the world best prepared as they can to kind of, as Cindy had mentioned, take on this global world that they're entering. So one of the things that is happening currently at Ellis is there's a big push for an arc of learning within our DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So we are actively working to expand our curriculum to be more inclusive and diverse. Our director of DEI has created an arc of learning with I can statements for our students at each grade level. So one I just wanted to share with you from the 3rd grade arc of learning is, I know about my family history and culture and about current and past contributions of people in my main identity groups. So as Jess said, we want to make sure that our students are seeing themselves, and we're examining our curriculum to see where they can see themselves reflected, but also where they can learn about others. So where they're starting to understand the similarities and differences between groups of people and different identity groups, and how they've contributed to both America and the world. And just overall, we have an overall goal to broaden the perspectives of our girls, to have them include a more global view. So as Jess mentioned, when we were looking at this last year, we really realized that if we take off that M from immigration and switch it to migration, it lends itself more to being a theme or a lens for the whole year, rather than just this one standalone unit. And it really broadens the amount of things we can kind of weave in throughout the year for the girls to see these patterns and these trends of what happens when people move and why people move, and how that can has shaped where we are today. So I'll talk a little bit now just about specifically in 3rd grade what this has looked like. So if you can go to the next slide, Jess, thank you. So here are the essential questions we came up with after doing this work and kind of reframing our thinking last year, which is why do people move? And a kind of sub question of that is what causes people to leave their homes and start new lives in different places. So we spent some time talking about those push and pull factors that typically we would have talked about just as an immigration unit, but really is true for all moving that happens, whether it's local, national, or global. What was life once like for immigrants in the United States? So looking back really to the turn of the 20th century at that kind of Ellis Island time, where do we see migration in our curriculum? And this is where we get a little bit more into that interdisciplinary area of looking at social studies as well as our literature and reading. And then are people still migrating? And so what was really great about looking at these questions this year, coming up in this, that we did this at the end of the year in 3rd grade, our girls really saw the patterns more than I would have ever expected. I don't know, Jen, I think, was feeling similarly, that they just kind of latched onto this idea of migration, and that they were much more familiar with it, calling it migration than calling it immigration. They were able to identify personal stories of family moving, and then also looking at all of our curriculum across the board and being able to identify that. So Jesse, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So giving ourselves this lens throughout the whole year, we were really able to open it up to the girls when we got to this, the more formal migration unit at the end of the year. And they were able to identify patterns of migration and those push and pull factors from throughout our curriculum. So one of the two of these books up here, or actually three of these books, were read alouds: Front Desk, Prairie Lotus, and Hannah's Journal. So Hannah's Journal is kind of more that typical what we would have thought of in the past as a book about from our immigration unit about a Russian migrant or immigrant in the early 1900s. Prairie Lotus was a read aloud that we did that brings in a different perspective to the frontier and westward migration. And that was an interesting way for the girls to see that, because actually the main character in Prairie Lotus was moving from California eastward instead of westward. So we were kind of finding different migration stories that we could weave in throughout. The Daring Escape of Ellen Craft looks at escaping from slavery and talking about more or less those harsher push factors that people have, and also giving us a little bit of a chance to talk about some forced migration, as well as what are those harder, more difficult reasons that people leave, and how can we examine that part of our history. And then Front Desk is a read aloud that the kids really enjoyed, that has so many different migration stories woven throughout it. So really, the more we looked at it, the more we realized we were able to bring this in through our read alouds, through our shared literature, and through our social studies curriculum as well. So by the end of the year, there was really no part of the day where we weren't looking at migration in some form or another. One culminating project, we can go on to the next slide, Jess, that we were excited to expand from our work. Every year, the third graders have typically done a migration or immigration report at the end of the year as kind of their final project. This year, there were two ways that we changed that project based on our work. One was telling the girls that they could go home and interview anyone about a migration story rather than just an immigration story. So they could interview a family member, a neighbor, a friend, about either an immigration story, so looking at their own family history, or a more recent migration story. So we had some girls who expanded that idea and looked at migrating from, for example, Pittsburgh to Houston, and how that's there are two very distinct cultures even within our same country there, that they can look at that and the pushes and pull factors within those movements. And then we also opened it up to members of the Ellis community. So as Cindy mentioned, if you look within your own community, you'll find more of these global perspectives. So we had some girls interview faculty members and staff members within our own Ellis teacher community. So this picture here is of one of our students, Chloe, interviewed a second grade teacher, Mr. Frazee, about his mom's immigration story. And I think it allowed the girls to understand that immigration really is, and migration is just still a huge part of our culture in the United States and within our Ellis community. More specifically. So it allowed them to really see this idea of migration is not something that just happened in the past, but is something that is currently happening as well. The one other interdisciplinary thing that we did was collaborated with our art teacher, Sarah Kerborst, on looking at artists who share migration stories through their art. And this year, as I'm sure all of you experienced, time was somehow short, even though we felt like we had more time with our students than we have in the past. Projects took longer. So I don't think that this was something that we got to do as fully as we would have liked to this year, but hopefully next year we'll get to dive into this collaboration even a little bit further. So I think that's all I have for third grade. Jen, I don't know if you want to add anything in.
I think it sounded good.
Okay.
And just, yeah, we tried to, with the history, to put all the pieces into a migration framework, even if it was just in our minds. And I think it helped us to think about them differently that way. William Penn coming to Pennsylvania as a migration story, William Penn's effect on Pennsylvania as a migration story. It was as helpful for us, I think, as for the kids.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Jess, we'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. So after speaking with Holly and Jen last summer and throughout the year, and in doing some planning, I also made a number of changes to our fourth grade social studies curriculum. So we were looking to answer the following questions: why do people migrate, and why do they settle where they do? Why do migrants face obstacles, and what kinds of obstacles might they face? Why do people migrate within a country, and what cultural contributions can be attributed to migration? And so just historically, our fourth grade social studies curriculum had been very geography heavy, geography focused. And that was purposeful, and it was good for a time. We studied, and still do, but we studied the regions of the United States, and our students came away with a much better understanding of geography, where we saw a real deficit in the past. And there was some focus within that given to history and economy, sort of as it related to those geographic regions that we studied. But I just continued to feel that it was really lacking in that global perspective. And given what I knew about what third grade was doing, and as the literature teacher, I just knew that there were opportunities to expand upon that. And I also know how compelling stories, the idea of story, can be to students. And so pairing social studies and literature just was a very natural way to make that change. So in taking the IM off of immigration to talk about migration throughout the year, it really did open some new doors. We still discussed immigration. Some of it continued the conversation started in third grade. Some of it repeated a little bit or built upon it in some ways. And students in fourth grade have the opportunity to study a literature selection that is about an immigration experience of a child. So we had students reading about migration stories from Vietnam, Kosovo, India, Denmark, Italy, China, and they spanned various historical periods. So one student might be reading a book that takes place in 2015 and another in 1893. And so they're able to sort of compare and contrast the experiences of migration during different historical periods. I also knew that in my curriculum, at some point in the year, I was going to get to the Great Depression. And so I saw this sort of time period, this in-between time period that I maybe could have given some more focus to. And so we, knowing that historical immigration sort of dropped off a bit during the Great Depression, I wanted to talk a bit about what was going on in our country sort of leading up to the Great Depression. And so we started discussing the Great Migration and the reasons millions of African Americans moved from the South to cities in the North. And so we had a very concentrated focus in that time period and the cultural contributions of African Americans during that time period. And so it just led to a wonderful study of culture. And one of the things you can see in the lower right-hand corner is the art of Jacob Lawrence, who is an African-American painter who documented the Great Migration through art. And our art teacher was doing a study of Jacob Lawrence at the same time. We discussed music of the time period and the influence of jazz. So we're still within the context of regions. And so in studying the Southeast, we learned a lot about music, blues and Dixieland jazz, and how during the Great Migration and this sort of cultural renaissance, the Harlem Renaissance, we talked about the influence of jazz music. And we read a book called Bud Not Buddy, which is not on the screen, but it has a really important connection to both the Great Depression and jazz music. We did as a read aloud a great book by Lisa Klein Ransom called Finding Langston. And it's about a boy and his father. Upon the death of his mother, they migrate to Chicago during the Great Migration and comes to learn about his name and how he got his name, and develops this love for the poetry of Langston Hughes, which we spent a bit of time on. So you can see that we really dug in and tried to do some things. We also did this flavor profile project, and I don't know about you, but I know that when I was in fourth grade, my palate was not nearly as refined as fourth graders of today, and so I wanted them sort of to understand, we have this appreciation for so many kinds of food. And so they did this flavor profile project this year where they got to learn about a particular dish that either could be from their culture or just one that they really love. And so we had students studying Japan and China and Greece and Mexico and countries in Africa. And what am I missing? India. And so they were learning about ingredients that came from different parts of the world and how they influence that culture and how we can come to appreciate that contribution to our culture. So just bringing these cultural contributions together into this study was a really important change that we made this year. And I would just end by saying we began to delve into some new territory. There's still a lot of opportunity, and one being that our music teacher is a bit of an expert in jazz. And just recently we were talking about ideas and how we can collaborate and host visitors, and hopefully our campus will be a bit more open next year, so we'll have those kinds of opportunities. But it has been a year of growth, not just for the kids, but certainly for me as a teacher as well. So it's been, I really appreciate this opportunity to have kind of dug in and learned new things, and hopefully given back just this sense of greater global awareness to the students, to the third and fourth, together with Holly and Jen, great students at Ellis.
Thank you, Jessica, Holly, Jen. Appreciate your time and sharing your project with all of us. Let's see. At this time, so we have some time left for question and answers. If there are any questions, if anybody would like to unmute, put a question in the chat. For any of our speakers, for Cindy and our Alice team. So go ahead and ask.
It's a little overwhelming, especially after the school year you've all had, and some of you being on the West Coast and all, to suddenly be thinking about all of this again has got to be a tad overwhelming.
And as you can see, Tracy mentioned also, we love how the Ellis School incorporated the Great Migration. Thanks, Tracy. If there are no questions, Kathleen has one. Are the essential questions for each discipline or umbrella questions for interdisciplinary?
That's a good question. I would say my initial thought is that in writing the essential questions, I was definitely, for myself, I was keeping our literature and social studies, that interdisciplinary connection in mind as I was writing them, but I can see how they could easily spread into other areas like music and art. Holly, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
I would agree with that, Jess. I think our essential questions. Actually, we were really just thinking about our social studies unit when we wrote them, but as we thought more about the year, and specifically again our literature studies, we realized that they could tie in to both of those as well, and I think would be good jumping off points to collaborate going forward with specialists like music and art.
I just wanted to say that I like the part of them changing to the migration. And I'm going to try to actually incorporate the mirrors and the windows to have the students, reflect upon themselves and then bring them into the bigger picture. I like that idea. I think that'll be one way to get them to buy into it. This will be something that is new at our school, unlike Ellis. We're not like globally thinking as a group, as a school altogether. But like the speaker just now told us, that doing these PDs, that we now have some ammunition to go back and persuade our principal to, buy into this as well.
Sure. So the flavor profile project just came from, at the beginning of the year, we sort of do an overview of sort of like what we call the peopling of America. So we talk about different people groups that came to the United States and where they settled and what contributions we can attribute to different people groups. And so I just sort of expanded upon that. The girls got to think about like, well, what foods do I really like or appreciate or attribute to my culture in some cases? And it was very interesting. So they basically just selected, I can think of ways that I will adapt or change this in the future. This was the first time I've done it, but they basically just selected a dish that they really liked or enjoyed as a family and explored the ingredients that made up that dish. And so there might have been one that emerged that was more related to culture. I can think of a student who actually have some pictures. I was just looking at them, but a student who was learning about cumin or different herbs or different spices or different things that come from different places in the world. And so they were learning about why is that? Is it that it grows there? Is it that it was important to that culture for a particular reason? And so they just created sort of like a poster of this dish and the ingredients that were in it, and then they highlighted a particular ingredient and why it was important in that culture in the world, wherever it was in the world that they were studying. And the goal and the hope for the future is to sort of do a cookbook that they can share with each other of like these different recipes that contain ingredients from different cultures around the world. Unfortunately, we were remote from like Thanksgiving to the second week of January. And that's sort of when this all was happening. It just didn't quite come together this year, but it's definitely something that we want to sort of do in the future. So take that one step further and think about how to even expand. We have a day at our school that we call Heritage Day. And I know our school's been thinking a lot about how to make some changes to Heritage Day to sort of also allow students to kind of see themselves more in it and it be a more meaningful experience. So maybe a connection to that in some way.
If there are no questions left, we can go ahead and go into our breakout rooms. We're a bit ahead of schedule, but again, this is your time now that you can continue working on your project. Obviously around noontime for some of us, if you'd like to talk to your team members and make the first 20 minutes or the next 20 minutes at your lunchtime, you're welcome to do so. So you have between now and 1:55 to work on your project. And I know that Michael Goodhart will be joining us at some point, I believe after 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and he'll come around. Also, Cindy is with us for the rest of the day, and she is willing and would love to check in with some of you if you would like to continue talking about any specifics of your project. So I want to thank our speakers once again today for being with us. And I'm here, I'll be in the background. Send me a message or come back to the main session if you need anything. And thank you all. And then I'll call you back at a couple of minutes before we end for the day.